Oi, what's the best game where you get to eat pie? What's the best game where you play a dead guy? Aye, you'll find out in VG247's podcast. Here, what's the best game where you swing from a rope? And what's the best game where you batter the Pope? Assassin's Creed 2. Like I said, you will find out in this your podcast.
Hello and welcome to VG247's Best Games Ever podcast, where we attempt to find the best game within a weirdly specific category. For example, this week, we're looking to find the best game that you wanted as a child, but never got. When I was a child, I coveted a game called The Adventures of Willie Beamish. A point-and-click adventure game, which I thought was the coolest game ever made because the main character was on the front cover riding a skateboard. I've never cared about skateboarding in any other context, which is why my father was quite right when he refused point blank to buy it for me on the basis that if a 7-year-old wanted to waste money on frivolities, then he should get a job in a textiles factory. He's a very old-fashioned guy. Speaking of old-fashioned, I'm joined today by Editor-in-Chief Tom.
It's a bit rude.
It was also very laboured. I do apologise.
I was trying to think of a catchphrase that I could start doing.
Yeah.
I'm thinking long-term about merch and stuff, but I haven't got one yet. So if anyone wants... got an idea for a catchphrase, send it over.
You used to have one, didn't you? It was just follow VG Tomo.
Yeah, I mean, we could carry on that on. The merch is already designed for that, so...
You could that's how you could sign on to the podcast. It works as a greeting, kind of. We've got Associate Editor Alex, long-suffering.
Hello. Yeah, always suffering. Suffering particularly this week because I'm like in the aftershocks of a COVID infection. So if I sound a bit croaky, that is why. Or if I miss a cough, I am trying to mute myself every time I cough. We're not in the same room, by the way. We are in different places.
Yeah. And we've got guides writer Kelsey.
Hello.
How you doing? So it's your second time on. In the time since you were on last, Alex has won like 3 or 4 times or something.
Oh, nice. Okay, I've got competition. I'll catch up somehow.
It wasn't a deal or anything. It was just, just happened to keep being good at it. So, and it was annoying Tom, which was the main draw for me, to be honest. Okay. I'm looking at what you guys have said. Kelsey, can we start with yours? Because I think this is the most interesting.
Yeah, go for it. Do you want to introduce it or should I?
No, you go for it.
Okay, so my pick is definitely a double-edged sword. Is Silent Hills. So this game actually never came out, which is why I never got it. And also, this might seem very, very recent for you two, because it was only, 8 years ago? I was 13,
Jesus,
14
it was 8
at the time.
years ago.
I'm shocked at the 8 years thing. I mean,
yeah,
13,
13,
I was
14.
going to say, like, you can't have been a child 4 years ago, surely. No, 8 years.
Yeah. So that for me was a pretty big deal because when I was 14, I wasn't even a massive gamer. I was very much glued to my Nintendo DS and my Nintendo Wii. And I was just chasing kind of every horror high I could at the time. I kind of grew up on horror media. So when PT kind of emerged, the playable teaser in, I think that was 2014, and it got all this traction on YouTube, it was good. It was scary. I was excited. I was excited for multiple reasons though, because obviously at the time horror was in this like weird place where people were developers were kind of going for more action routes. We saw that in Resident Evil later on. The same thing kind of happened to Silent Hill a bit. So seeing that they were trying to make Silent Hill scary again kind of got me excited. And also at the time, I did not have a PlayStation. So little me was just like, well, maybe by the time this game is actually out and they kind of like attempt to revive Silent Hill, I'll actually have a PlayStation. I'll be able to play it. I'll be able to save up my pocket money. That never happened, obviously. But yeah, that was one of... Until Resident Evil 7 was announced, that was hands down what I was most excited for. More so than any sort of game growing up, because I was fortunate enough to kind of have all the Nintendo games that I wanted. So beyond that, it was just horror games.
I didn't realize that you were talking about the playable teaser. When you initially emailed about it, I just thought you meant like Silent Hill in general, and now I'm like, oh no, I'm really old. I was definitely in my 30s and working for Tom on a website when PT came out.
It's weird because at the time I had no idea who kind of like Kojima and Del Toro were, because I didn't follow that stuff. I was 14. I just cared about games at face value. So even looking back, I'm like, okay, even more gutted that kind of didn't come to fruition. But it is what it is. I ended up getting an Xbox in the end. I was never a PlayStation gamer.
Is that because of the slight? Because
Well, it was because I never could afford a console in the end, and then by the time I got a job, Resident Evil 7 got announced, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna get an Xbox because it was cheaper at the time. So yeah,
Was this
but
Resi?
it could have been so different.
Was this Resi 7?
Yeah.
Okay, because that was a real reinvention, and probably like
Yeah, that went through the same thing, which is exactly why I
Yeah.
got so excited about that as well.
And I think like wasn't Resi 7 quite heavily inspired by PT?
I do not know.
I would say I
I'd-
think PT they definitely looked at it, but also what's Amnesia?
Amnesia.
Oh,
That's the
yeah.
one, right?
That's what I mean. When like in the 2010s, when like horror was in that weird place, the only
Mm.
things kind of carrying horror along were games like Amnesia, even Slender. So
Yeah.
PT
Well,
came
Slender,
about, and
that
it
was
inspired
the-
so many people.
Yeah, PT was like it's been so influential and it's had such a like people still have parties now and do special events where they've like someone they know has still got the demo because like and
Yeah.
it's becoming less and less now because as older machines break down and stuff, you can't transfer it to new machines or anything like that. People are
There was that one guy, I can't remember his name,
Yeah.
who remade the entire thing.
Yeah, it was like
and
a
tried to put it on
shot for shot.
HIO. And
Yeah.
obviously Konami were like, you know, can you take this down? But I'm pretty sure they offered him an internship off the back of that, and they thanked him for it because seeing him like remake the demo inspired so many developers at Konami to like start making new games. So still waiting on that reinvention of Silent Hill, but
Yeah.
could
It's-
very well be coming. Who knows?
I mean,
But
it's
yeah.
insane it's insane how little. I mean, it was such a short thing. I don't remember it being like
It was like
we
half
did
an hour
videos
long.
about it. Yeah, it's like it's just a real short burst of perfection, right? And it's like it's one of the most brilliant and perfect horror experiences ever made, and it was just an advert.
Yeah.
You're like, you know, it was almost like, well, this is Kojima on an off day, and it's amazing.
I think
So-
the fact that it was kind of like so elusive at the time as well. Like when PT emerged, nobody actually knew at first that it was a
Mm.
demo for Silent Hills until
Yeah,
I think someone eventually solved that puzzle at the end and figured it out.
right.
And
It was on a
shared that
live
cutscene.
stream, right?
Yeah,
Like somebody actually got to the end of it, and that was the first anyone knew of it.
yeah, and then it kind of that obviously helped with the whole kind of excitement surrounding it.
Yeah,
It was mysterious.
It's a
Everyone wanted to
brilliant-
know
Funny
more.
Quite
It's
annoyed by this choice. Not because it's a good choice, isn't it? I'm trying to think of problems.
You're annoyed at it because it's a good choice. Is that what?
Yeah, it's like because the whole I couldn't get it because no one could get it is a good angle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
My one thing is, did you say it did get released? Did you have any means of getting it? Like, were you trying to earn money back then? Did
When
you
I
have
was-
a job?
Yeah, I was doing work experience. I got paid very, very petty money for it.
Right.
But part of me was like, no, I want my PlayStation 4.
And you got that Xbox in the end.
Mm.
Yeah, in the end.
Like,
Never
it's-
got
it's
to play
fun-
PT though.
It's funny talking about PT and Resident Evil because I'm trying to remember the timeline, but it's sort of like Resident Evil 7 was introduced in a very similar way, except they didn't reveal it to the public. Like Kelsey, obviously, this is way before your time, but you
Yeah.
guys might remember like going to Capcom's
Kitchen.
office and being shown a demo
Mm.
where they weren't saying it was Resident Evil,
hmm
and they were just like, "Here's this demo for this thing," and it had Peter Fabiano, formerly of Capcom, now Bungie, getting his head cut off and all that,
Yeah.
and they showed us that, and much of the same as PT was like, "Here's this playable teaser," but they never said it was Silent Hill. That
Mm.
was the same for Resident Evil, and then obviously it would have been 4 or 5 months later that we went to E3 and went, "Oh, it's Resident
like-
Evil."
After
I never knew about
after
that.
demo, you know, Pete Fabiano's in, as you say, he's a character in the game. He's in flashbacks,
And he's a
stuff.
producer on the game. He was a producer on the
he's
game.
one of the Capcom guys. I ended up working on that game after it was revealed, and meeting. I had no idea that he was like one of the guys where, and just met him, and he was like, he's this real person. Like, I saw you die. That was surreal.
I had exactly the same thing because I went out to Capcom for Resident Evil 2,
Mm.
and he wasn't. I don't think he was working on Resident Evil 2,
He was
but
on 3.
But he came out for dinner one night, and I ended up sitting next to him at the dinner table, and it was like this surreal thing of we're chatting about Blackadder and British comedy and stuff. And the same thing, every time just looking at him, I'm going like, I've seen you get your head chopped off about 4 times. Yeah. Because that's the surreal thing about face scan, right? Like,
I'd love to be face scanned. I'd love to have a 3D model of myself that I can just put anywhere. That's weird, actually. That's a weird thing to. Let's not explore that. Tom, what's your choice?
Made a choice quite late yesterday because I was busy.
Yeah.
I was like thinking back to my childhood, which was more than 8 years ago.
Let's face it, it's decades and decades.
So I was thinking, like, what happened as when I was a child? And I was like, games TV shows were a thing. They were like TV shows where they showed off games. There's any way you could see many games before you could play them. Games Master, Bad Influence, etc.
Yeah.
So Games Master, I actually had a few games I was desperate for as a kid. One of them, this isn't my choice, but do you remember that one where you used to? It was like the challenge game. It probably was in Games Master. It was probably Games World on Sky. It was one of those shows where you used to throw knives at someone who was like in like they were like tied up. You used to have to cut the ropes with the knife. Do you remember that? No one's got a clue. No one's got a clue.
No,
if you're listening to this, it's like a mini game. You used to move the cursor around, and like the person was moving all over the place.
Is this on the C64 or something?
I don't know, but I remember I really wanted this game because I think it was in Games World, actually on Sky or something like that.
And
it was like a challenge, and you used to have to throw these knives to cut someone out. But anyway, Games Master, they used to have challenges throughout the show, and one of them was FIFA. And at the time, this was 1993, FIFA was quite basic. It was like Mega Drive, SNES type FIFA, and it was pretty basic, fixed camera, isometric.
Yeah, I actually showed World Cup Italia 90.
I actually looked better than World Cup Italia 90, Jim. That was like blobs, overhead blobs. But you could used to run from the centre circle to score straight down the middle. It was a bit of a glitch.
I mean, what I'm saying is, like, it was an incremental step above like.
Yes, it was a big step. I actually showed my mum FIFA on the Mega Drive because I was so convinced it looked real. I was like, Mum, come and look at this. It looks real, doesn't it? It looks real. It didn't. It looked like one of the most basic games of all time now. But anyway, FIFA 93 or whatever it was that year. So it's probably 92. They released a version on the 3DO. 3DO was like a failed console, but it was way more advanced than anything else. Like we had before the PlayStation, all that kind of stuff. So it was like next gen, but only very few people had it. Like nobody I knew had one, and they had it on Games Master, and they were playing FIFA on the 3DO. But FIFA on the 3DO, it had what at the time was like unbelievable to my eyes, which was like a proper 3D camera, and you saw all these different camera angles, and it looked like FIFA on a TV, like when you were watching like football, real football, to my whatever 11-year-old eyes.
I remember it looked incredible.
And like it's just an unbelievably good look. I was like, oh god, we've got to get a 3DO. Like it's just unbelievable. We have to get a 3DO. And they had other stuff like that, Need for Speed. It was Need for Speed, right? Before it became the not as.
Was that the one that had Marky Mark in it or something?
I can't remember, but it was like it had like proper. It had all the FMV type stuff. I think back then it was.
That's what I mean. I feel like it had Mark Wahlberg in it, or maybe I'm confusing that with. I know Mark Wahlberg had a terrible Sega CD game, Make My Music video. He was deep in all that FMV. I'm sure he was in Need for Speed.
He may well have been, but yeah, 3DO basically had a couple of things, but FIFA was the one I was desperate for because I saw them playing it on Games Master, and like compare FIFA then to football games now, and it's like it's most likely absolutely awful. But football games were terrible back then. Like people like Sensible Soccer, it's rubbish, right? Go and play Sensible Soccer. It's not very good. If you think it's good, you clung onto the past too much. But anyway, back then I was desperate for to FIFA on the 3DO essentially, but no one had it. You're laughing at your little funny joke.
Oh, that's funny.
But anyway, judged back then, this was incredible. I wanted it. Other people that I was friends with at school wanted it, but nobody could get it because nobody was going to buy a 3DO.
Yeah,
because it's just.
Was it like £600 or something?
It was expensive.
$700.
It was expensive, and like there weren't that many games for it really.
No,
and like there was clearly other stuff coming. Like I was a Sega kid then, So I was like, we must get a 32X, we must, and everything else. Like, and it's just, that's a silly thing to do, obviously.
It was
But,
the
yeah.
3DO is an interesting one because it was a horrible, just a horrible venture, and it died a death, as we know. It was the brainchild of Trip Hawkins, and his whole thing, because he used to work at EA, and he, as an EA executive, got fed up with having to pay the console manufacturers fees to publish games for their systems. So his big idea was, well, what if we make a console that's just, there's no fees to publish on it, and it's just a set of standards. Anyone can manufacture the machines. Anyone can put anything they want onto it. And it's like, okay, that sounds great, except if you are 3DO, how are you making money? And they didn't, and it went bust. And he's now a laughingstock. But it's interesting because there's a lot of stuff that happened on the 3DO, like FIFA International Soccer, that are sort of like, as you say, it was next gen before next gen. It was like the harbinger of the PlayStation era, really. It was like a little glimpse of...
Yeah, even when you look at like the first FIFA on PlayStation, like it looked quite naff because they tried to do a bit more with it, and it couldn't. It was before they went with polygons. It was like sort of an extension of what they did on the 3DO and Mega Drive.
Yeah, it was kind of a 1.5
with more 3D, and it was probably worse. It was one of the like worse than what we had before, because they went like what we think now with like 3D polygon characters and players. But I actually think that it was better game before the PlayStation version arrived. I remember getting that version for Christmas once and thinking, why did I ask for this? It's just unplayable rubbish. But I didn't say that to my mum. We spent all of her hard-earned money on it.
I was imagining you as a child reviewing it in the living room.
Throwing it back into her face. Like, no.
Hitting James with it.
Yeah. I think, like, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but as a counter to the game that you could never buy, this was the game that was available, but most people couldn't buy because it was just, the barrier to entry was too high, and quite a ridiculous thing to do, because why spend all your, as a child, your hard-earned paper round money on a console that was going to die?
So we've got two really interesting ones here, where the reason you couldn't get them wasn't just because, like, you know, like your parents said no. It's like there's some really kind of proper kind of industry reasons why these games were difficult to come by. Alex, what's the story behind your choice? Because I feel like I don't know the history of this. I've heard of it, but I don't know. Is there a reason? Is it because of the country you were in, or?
You're muted.
You're muted.
I'm a genius. Yeah, it sort of threads the needle of the two that we just talked about. Because it's to do with the country I was in. I'm in. And so my choice is Chrono Trigger, which it took a long time to think about this, because there were a lot of games that I wasn't allowed as a kid, and there were a lot of games that there's a lot of games that I wasn't allowed but then somehow got, which is probably another category for another time. But yeah, of all the games that I desperately wanted as a child and never got my hands on until much later in life, this is the best game of that bunch, in the sense that, in my opinion, this is one of the top 10 games of all time. It's like a really important piece of history. And yeah, it's just fabulous. But the thing about it was, it came out in 1995, early 1995 in Japan, and then it came to North America later in 1995. But this was the era when publishers just didn't believe that Japanese games like this had much of a market in Europe, which is why, America famously, right, they got Final Fantasy 1, 4, and 6 as 1, 2, and 3. They renamed them to 1, 2, and 3 and confused the world forevermore. And even when they brought 4 over to the States, in Japan, they re-released that version and called it Final Fantasy IV Easy Type, because they basically made the entire game really easy, because they assumed Westerners were too stupid to understand all these deep RPG mechanics. Which is funny, because Final Fantasy was inspired by wizardry, and which was inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, which of course is Western to begin with, but hey-ho. That was the attitude back then. And for some reason, that went even more so for Europe. So there were so many games that we didn't get. We didn't get any of the first 6 Final Fantasy games. There were some Phantasy Star games skipped us, stuff like that. And one of those games, unfortunately, was Chrono Trigger. And even when it came to PlayStation in 1999 and 2001 was when the PS1 version came out in the West, they didn't release it in Europe. And so I actually wasn't obsessed with Chrono Trigger in 1995 because I only really became a JRPG person in the PS1 era. But you sort of imagine you become a huge fan via games like Grandia, Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, stuff like that, which that was me. And Pokemon Red and Blue as well was the other big Japanese RPG
that
gateway.
whole era was a real awakening for
JRPGs in general.
in Europe, yeah.
So then you go online and you start reading, and all your American friends and counterparts are talking about how there's these 2 games that are genre defining where none of the ones you love would exist without it, and that would be Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger.
Yeah.
And you just can't get it. And back in those days, it's definitely an era thing where back in those days, you obviously couldn't just create a US store account and buy the game and download it as you can now. But also, it was really difficult to launch foreign games. Like, the one I always think of when I think about imports is Animal Crossing on the Gamecube. I feel like that was the first awakening in Europe for whatever reason. Nintendo Europe decided to wait an extra year after releasing that game in the US to release it in the UK. And I remember, I wish I could remember what the name of the website was. I want to say Andrea Sang, but that was a news site. But
it's so weird to think that Europeans wouldn't understand a game about colonialism. But
yeah.
We invented it.
But I just remember ordering Animal Crossing, and there was the action replay disc you put in your GameCube and then swap Animal Crossing in. I remember also ordering a Wavebird from that website because the Wavebird wasn't available in Europe. The wireless
still
controller
coveted now. Still
for the
They
GameCube.
changed. Didn't they change the Animal Crossing for GameCube when they totally westernized it? Because wasn't it initially Animal Forest in Japan?
Yeah,
it was Animal Forest. Yeah, and I think so when I think back on that stuff, wasn't possible. By the GameCube era, you could buy a disc and use that disc to hack the machine. I remember doing it for Smash Bros. Brawl as well, because for some reason that also was delayed for Europe. But this wasn't possible then. In fact, the US Super Nintendo cartridges are a different shape. So even if I'd acquired one, it wouldn't have physically gone into my SNES. And so that was me and Chrono Cross. And it was this game where I watched clips of the anime cutscenes from the PlayStation version. There was no YouTube back then, but you would download tiny, horrifically compressed MOV files from fan sites.
Is that
and
the
watch
sort of
it.
thing that would have ended up on cover discs as well, or?
Probably, yeah. And so I just remember, obsessing over that game, hearing about that game when it was just a Super Nintendo game, and then the PlayStation port gets announced, and it's like, oh my god, finally we're going to get it, and then they didn't bring it out, and it was just brutal, and it wasn't really. And so eventually, obviously, I played it through emulation, as emulation got a bit better and that sort of thing, and then eventually, of course, they brought it to the DS, but that wasn't until 2009. So, and by then, I was definitely an adult. So, Chrono Trigger, it's one of the best games of all time. The legacy of it is incredible. I'm reviewing a game right now. Trying to think when this goes live. Does this go live this week?
Yeah, it will. Yeah, I'll go live on Friday.
So I'm reviewing a game right now. I can say I'm reviewing it. I can't say anything bad about it. But Live Alive, which is a game Nintendo's putting out a remake of, is sort of the game that the guys who made Chrono Trigger did before they went to Chrono Trigger. It's so interesting to finally play that game, because that game never got a Western release at all. Chrono Trigger was the first game to use the term New Game Plus. So when everyone talks about that now in every game, in Assassin's Creed and everything else, that's from Chrono Trigger. The whole industry owes so much to that game. And that's why I was like, well, when I think about games that I lusted after for years and ultimately didn't get until much later in my life, the absolute best game of the bunch, the most important game of the bunch, is Chrono Trigger. So that's my pick.
I mean, you made a beautiful case for it.
But just an argument.
You're going to say what I'm about to say. I know it.
I've got a few arguments, so I'll do one. You can jump in with another one.
Okay.
Right. Best game you wanted as a child but never got.
Yeah, I never got
That
it
was
as a
my
child.
argument.
I never got it as a
got
child.
It. You got. I don't
Yeah,
think
you got it in the end.
You got it. I mean, I think that disqualifies you automatically.
I
Other
mean,
thing, which I was
Donaldson's still very young. We've got to remember.
I mean, he's not a child anymore.
Yeah,
I mean,
you know, how old were you in 2001?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I would have been. God, that's an interesting. I would have been 11, wouldn't I? Yeah.
In 2001, you were 11.
No, that's fucking hell.
Maybe you were. I mean, I don't know when you were born.
I would have been 12. Yeah.
You would have been 12.
I was just working doing the maths. 1989.
I couldn't walk.
Jesus. Okay.
Fine.
Yeah, I would have been 12. That was so. You think about my history, right? Like,
where did you get? When did you finally get Chrono Trigger? When did you play it?
Well, DS. So 2009. There was
dabbling with an adult by that point.
There was dabbling with low quality emulation, but
were
it was 8 years later by the time I got
the. How old were you when you got it on the DS?
21. Wait,
yeah. I think it's allowed. I think it's.
Were you an adult when you got on the DS or not?
I was 20. I was at university.
Well, yeah, 19, 20.
Technically, your brain doesn't mature properly until you're in your 20s and like mid-20s, 25.
I can't believe, by the way, Tom, you just somehow made me doubt my own age. I said 11, and you went, what? And I was like, oh my God, have I just said the wrong thing? How old am I, actually?
Like, me and him both were both aghast when you said you were 11 in 2001, because I think we were both like in our 20s by that point.
If you think about my history, I started doing the Final Fantasy fan site and became obsessed with all that stuff when I was about 11. So when the PlayStation 1 version of Chrono Trigger came about, it was right as I was like falling deep into the thick of this. And so everybody on the forums was really excited for the PS1 release, all that sort of stuff. And then it just never happened for me.
So it must have felt like a betrayal for a long time, I guess, well,
it just sucked back then because you couldn't get you couldn't get
one
the
of
old
the
Final
major
Fantasy
disappointments
games
of your life at the time.
Yeah, and it was like, you know, and it was also that weird thing of like gradually emulation became an option as soon as emulation got better and better and better. But then it was like this thing of no, I want to play the version with the anime cutscenes and all this stuff that's been added.
Yeah.
And so that was and you know, it was a long suffering Chrono, right? Europe only just this year got Chrono Cross for the first time ever over 20 years after it originally released the sequel. That whole series just sort of got screwed in that sense.
That's insane. Somehow you've got like an answer that's like current in that sense as well. As I say, we've got three really interesting choices here, and they're all sort of like, not only could I not play it as a child, but there's a really good reason why, and it's not just because my dad didn't see the point.
I think two of them should be disqualified.
And which two would those be?
Do you want to hear why? Right. So.
Right. Okay.
Right. So Kelsey's choice, right?
Yeah.
So this game, the best game that you wanted as a child but never got, is a game that no one's actually ever seen.
Well, we saw the demo.
But the PT demo is incredible though.
Yeah,
we're not talking about the demo. That's if this was best demo we got for a game that was never
we
released.
can talk about PT then, because I technically never played PT.
No, it's too late now. It's far too late for that. So that's disqualified because that Silent Hill was like, who knows, right? What we saw was that little bit with Norman Reedus at the end in the street, right? So just no clue how good that game is. Alex's one, right? He's just admitted that he's played it. Okay, he got it. He played it. It's fine. It's fair enough.
You know what, Tom? I didn't just play it. Once I finally got that game in full in 2009 as a grown-ass adult, I have a habit of replaying that game at least once every 18 months or so. It's that good. I replay it on the regular.
Just digging this hole even deeper.
Right. So
okay.
But imagine how my life would have changed had I got that game as a child.
Yeah,
a game that good.
It does say
Chrono
wanted
Trigger
as a child, but never got while still a child. So, I mean, he's got you on that technicality.
Only leaves one of us, doesn't it? I mean,
yeah.
I think it would be a real shame to let a FIFA game win.
There is also that, but I tell you what. Right. So if Kelsey had said PT, that would win because it's really interesting. It's the most interesting one. But I'm still going to give it to Kelsey because I think the allure of Silent Hills is even greater for the fact that it never got made and clearly exists in probably a 75% complete form somewhere. So like
people will still be talking about PT and Silent Hills in 15 years.
To have a game that was never completed and never released to have this much influence over the genre is, frankly, unprecedented. So I think for that reason, whether it's PT or Silent Hills being entered in, we can count them as one thing. And that's the winner as far as I'm concerned. Right. And I can't give it to a FIFA game.
Just to be clear, so next week when we do another podcast, I was going to bring in multiple games, right? That's the new rule.
No, because because Silent Hills and PT are intertwined and they cannot be separated as concepts.
Right. In your mind, most
they are
people
the same thing.
Can see them as separate things. One, a demo.
No, because
and the other one, a thing that doesn't exist.
Because they are both intent. They are both like statements of intent. They are both concepts that never quite. They both represent a Silent Hills game that never exists, that never actually.
And
existed.
Actually, my second choice for this weirdly would have been Sonic Crackers, which people probably don't even know what that is. But Sonic Crackers was like a beta, an alpha, whatever build that leaked, and it was like a concept build, and the basic concepts of it became Knuckles Chaotix, the 32X game, which was also another game I wanted as a child but never got. And I genuinely did never get that because I've never owned it because it's like £800 for a box copy these days.
Should have picked that.
But it's not a good game. It's the problem with Chaotix. Okay. I have played it, via other people.
That's the other thing, Tom. We can be reasonably sure that Silent Hills would have been a good game had it. Like we can be almost assured on that one.
No, it's fine. Involved. It's fine. We're just changing the rules. It's fine. I just know for next time that we can just make stuff up.
All right. Well, look, I think we've decided pretty definitively there that Silent Hills is the best game you wanted as a child but never got.
Yeah.
I can respect that. I can go for that one.
Tom can't respect it, but he's going to have to live with it.
I believe thoroughly in my interpretation of the question. But yeah. I as soon as Kelsey said what her pick was, I was like, before me and Tom had even spoken, I was like, that's definitely the winner.
100%. Yeah.
I don't know. Cool. I was pretty convinced by the whole Chrono Trigger argument.
It's one of the best games ever made, but I did. It depends on how pedantic you're being about the wording.
Yeah. Very.
Yeah.
All right. So Silent Hills is the best game that one of the panel wanted as a child but never got. Thank you for listening. We are, of course, not just a podcast. We are VG247. We do news, we do reviews, we do guides, we do features, we do all that great stuff. So check out the website at VG247.com. And if you like this podcast, please, by all means, leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts, because it really helps us out. People see a 5-star podcast and they think, I've got to check that out. But people see a 4-star podcast and they think, don't feel so compelled to check that out. So if you think the podcast is worth less than 5 stars, just take a walk. Thanks so much for listening. If you like the show, please review it, subscribe, and check out what else we do on VG247.com.